Given the wonderful freedom of a secular conversation where no one's going to say anything about your right to say it, why don't you say what you actually think? How about that?
Okay, yes, Anne, and then I'd love to hear from Frank.
Can I just say that what I find interesting about your book, Christopher, is that everyone's the same, and yet we're all violently different. And if you are a cultural Catholic, as I am, I don't listen to what the Pope says every day and take my guide from him. My mother, who's 84, says she had a Vatican bypass 30 years ago. You know, it isn't like you see. Maybe because you're not a believer, you don't understand that
Sounds like progress of a kind.
No, but she converted from a completely non-believing family when she was about 20. But the thing is that religion is so manifestly pluralist as well. I mean, there's so many different ways in which people see God. And even within the Catholic Church, there's violently different ways in which people practice their faith.
Did you say
and
violently?
The idea... I missed that.
You did say violently.
Well, violently, I agree with you. I agree with you on all that you say about violence among religion. And that's the point. I like the old Greeks and the Romans. You had a god of war and a god of peace, and, you know, you had different kind of gods. I like that. But the idea that we're all following the Pope, I think, is a bit misguided.
Okay,
You're either a Roman Catholic or not. You can be tons of kinds of Catholic.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
There are 5 popes I know about. There's a Coptic pope, there's an Eastern pope.
No, all right. Well, I'm talking about the one in Rome.
Not accepting the authority of the Holy Father, I leave it to this father. But I mean, I think there's not.
I think since about 1969,
people who take their faith a la carte and cafeteria style don't impress me very much on the points of principle and conviction that we're supposed to be talking about.
If Catholics were following the Pope, they'd all have 10 children. They don't.
Well,
Frank Brennan,
that's a start too.
Can I hear Frank Brennan on the
progress of a kind?
The fundamental point that Christopher Hitchens made, which is how can you say something which is clearly against the teachings of your church, clearly against the teachings of the Pope?
I haven't said anything clearly against the teaching of my church or against my Pope. I have drawn a distinction.
So, but hang on a sec.
Is
homosexuality a sin or otherwise? And if it is a sin, is it the sort of sin that would see you go to hell according to Roman Catholicism?
No, homosexuality is not a sin. It's a disposition. If you want to argue, about whether particular homosexual acts are appropriate for an individual in a moral context, that would require a pastoral discussion with that individual. What we were discussing previously was what should be the law in a civil society such as Australia, where you have people of different religious convictions. And the question was whether or not there should be same-sex marriage. Now, that is not an issue which is resolved by determining what the Catholic Church says to its own members it regards as moral or immoral. They're quite distinct questions.
Walid Ali, you're on the same question, if you like. Is homosexuality a sin in Islam?
I'll get to that. The thing I want to say... No. But there's an important distinction here, and I get often frustrated with this discourse of lumping the Islamic tradition in with the Christian tradition, particularly the Catholic tradition, because they're structurally so fundamentally different. The Catholic tradition has a church which has a kind of divine imprimatur and authority. The Islamic tradition is a far more anarchic tradition in a sense. There is no centralised authority, especially in the Sunni tradition. So to say the Islamic teaching on anything is X is a position that immediately becomes contestable. You can try to verify it statistically or otherwise, but the point is that at the very least in theory, if not in practice, any position that you take is a position that you take that may or may not, that may be fallible and is open to being contested by other Islamic theologians or other Muslims and so on. So on any question, whether it be homosexuality or it be anything, you will find a position that the majority take. And on the question of homosexuality, undoubtedly, if you took a poll in the Muslim world, you would find that most people would consider it sinful behaviour. But if you took...
Dodging it. It's not what Muslims think, it's what Islam teaches.
Yeah, but, okay, but my question is, what exactly is your repository of a list of Islamic conclusions? There is no book called Islamic law. There is no Islamic body that says this is what Islam teaches. It has for 1400 years been an ongoing conversation. So, and what
ongoing conversations are very good.
Yeah, but that's my point. If there is a criticism I would make of the Muslim world, it is this. It is that, particularly in the post-colonial era, as religion has become an identity movement rather than something that's actually anything to do with spirituality and faith, in my view. Particularly in the post-colonial world, that religiosity, Islam, has become instrumentalised as a list of conclusions, as a political ideology, as though there is some manifesto you can just download from a computer and install into a society. It doesn't work that way, certainly not in the classical tradition. The classical tradition was one of constant debate. That's why it was very difficult to get something like an inquisition going. We managed it at some point, but it was not terribly successful, and it ultimately crumbled, because you can't ultimately centralise authority to make definitive statements on behalf of God in the Islamic tradition. That's an act of polytheism to do that in the Islamic
I'm just going to interrupt the flow for a minute, because we have another question tonight. It comes from Heidi Crichton.
Yes, my question is for Christopher Hitchens. With many voters using a politician's religious persuasion to influence their vote, do you expect to see in your lifetime an openly atheist politician be appointed to the head of government, for example, for Australia, Britain or the United States?
I'm not going to let Christopher answer this immediately. I'd rather throw it around the panel first. Frank Brennan.
I think undoubtedly. I mean, perhaps not so readily in the United States, or if in the United States the presidential candidate were atheist, he or she would probably still proclaim some religious conviction in that that's part of the United States. But I think here in Australia, whether or not one of our political leaders, I would think, was an atheist or of a religious persuasion, I think is almost an irrelevance to the Australian community.
OK, let's hear from Anne Henderson on that. I mean, I can't think of any atheist prime ministers, Australian prime ministers to date. You might know some. Certainly not openly atheist.
Gough openly proclaimed he was a believer, but anyway, it's not so much whether you're an atheist or an agnostic or a believer, it's what you say to the people you are. I find it interesting at the moment, and I wouldn't have thought it would have happened in the 1980s, that all leaders of countries in the West seem to want to go to church every Sunday. Christian churches. It was interesting that Tony Blair wouldn't take on being a Catholic. I think is he considering it now?
He's done it.
Became a Catholic now after he left his position as Prime Minister.